All right, I think we're live now. Hello, everybody. It's been quite a while since I've made much content. I'm here with Dr. Wolfheze. He's been on the channel a few times before. You do currently streams for Arctos as well, I believe.
Yes, Arctos Interregnum. So, by the way, thank you for having me on the show again, and good afternoon to our audience. Yes, so I'm doing Interregnum for Arctos for a while because they're having some staffing problems and they haven't anybody to do it. So I'm doing it on a volunteer basis and talking with some other authors between authors.
Yeah, because you're a writer for Arctos as well, right? You've several books published with them.
Yes, well, that's also going very slow. As we know, the whole dissident right movement has problems. So do the publishers, and books are coming out very slowly. So are other materials, and I'm helping out best I can.
Right. Well, the reason I invited you on is, of course, to talk about Ukraine. You are sort of an expert on the matter, especially from the Russian perspective. I usually don't talk much about current events. It's been always a policy of mine, but a lot of people want to talk about it. It's a topic that's sort of inevitable. For any Dutch listeners, we do regular podcasts on Euro Podcasts and Dietze Bazuin where we've talked about the situation, but for an international audience, we haven't really addressed it. I think from the dissident right particularly, there hasn't been much of a perspective coming from Europe itself, because there aren't that many European content creators as well. Our perspective is, of course, very different from the American one, because we are much more closely involved with the consequences of the Ukraine war. Of course, the world economy has been affected by it, but Europe more so, especially the energy markets, of course, and food security, which also indirectly affects, for example, migration. Food insecurity in the third world is not good for our migrant situation. My position on this war has been more or less that it is a tragedy that could have been prevented if there had been better leadership in the West, a more diplomatic position. I find the Ukrainian nationalists to be somewhat at fault as well, because if I had been a nationalist in Ukraine, I would not have been so aggressively pushing my country towards the West, knowing what happens with the moral standards of the West. And having pursued more of a third position politics between Russia and NATO would have been better for Ukraine. But, well, that's all too late now. There is a war. That's not going to end anytime soon, it looks like. And the consequences are tragic for everyone. Russia is isolated internationally. Ukraine is, of course, being destroyed as a nation. The world economy is affected, etc., etc. There's a massive amount of refugees in Ukraine. But the reason I asked specifically to Wolfheze on is to give the Russian perspective on why they felt they had to do this and there were no other measures. So if you could give sort of the Russian perspective on it, because I believe you were present at the declaration of the war, right?
Well, this is something of a challenge because I am not somebody that's speaking for Russia, nor would I want to be. Actually, the group that I belong to, I have written it in the screen. It's a Geopolitica. It's a think tank, a Eurasianist think tank based in Moscow, but with affiliates all around the world, all the way to Africa and South America. And this Eurasianist movement, it is something much bigger than just being pro-Russian and cheerleading for Russia. It's a very old movement that existed in times when Russia was communist. It existed in the times after Russia was communist, and it exists under Putin. And this movement has a vision for Eurasia as a whole, not just for Russia. Of course, Russia is a very important central part of Eurasia, but that doesn't mean that the priorities of other nations should be subordinate to it. That's my view, at least. And also, there are some differences in Eurasianism according to country. So there is a different Eurasianism that exists in France, a different Eurasianism that exists in Germany, and a different Eurasianism that exists in Russia. Of course, I have a lot of contacts in Russia. That's inevitable because that's where the study centers are based. But I cannot speak for Russia, neither would I want to. I believe that no matter what happens in this conflict, all our nations in Europe have our own interest, our own sovereign interest at stake here.
Well, that's the
And we should
problem,
be,
of course. The problem with our modern politics is, of course, that our politicians don't seem to realize that our nations have interests. We follow the American agenda, and that's about it.
yes. Well, I'm not talking here about our elites. Our elites in the West, they're just hopeless. I have written them off a long time ago as a power for any good, and all other people have to do thinking, alternative thinking, and Eurasianists are doing that. There is another famous, a famous Eurasianist living in Belgium, as a matter of fact, South the Netherlands, Robert Steukers. He knows a lot about it. He wrote a lot about it. I reviewed his books. I advise people to look at his work on synergies and
Synergy.
Synergon. Yeah, and Synergon. Synergon is now another good outlet with the Eurasianist materials.
Yeah, and it's in multiple languages as well.
Yes.
So it's for a lot of
Yes,
Europeans.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes. About our elites, they have, of course, abolished any pretense to sovereignty, and nothing is clearer than that during this Ukraine crisis. So we can see that, in fact, almost all EU countries, and even some beyond, are now just tiptoeing the line set out in the real power center of the West, which is the Pentagon and Washington. Even a country like Switzerland, which is officially neutral, has joined in the fray. It has joined the economic boycott.
Yeah, that's sort of the consequence of this war, is that we're moving into a genuinely more multipolar world where, it's lots of people have said this, of course, sort of a new Iron Curtain being drawn, and there's distinctions between nations sharpening. But we'll have to see, of course, because this policy specifically is very dependent on who is in charge in the United States. There's a reason there was no war under Trump, and there's a reason there's a war now. So policies, we will see if it will be like an actual Cold War or a temporary chill.
Yes, of course, since the Biden coup, as I call it, the so-called Neocons, which include Neo-Trotskyite outfit, has come to power there. And they are pursuing now policies that have been in the making for a long time. We should not underestimate that the work being done now in Ukraine is based on years of preparation, which continued under Trump, right?
The coup was in 2014, of course, in Ukraine, right. the Maidan revolution. And that started the process. Sorry?
And even before that, we should remember the Orange Revolution in 2004.
Yes.
That's the actual start. Yes.
Yeah, but in 2014, there was a marked shift towards more cooperation with the American systems, with NATO, etc. There was, of course, the referendum here in the Netherlands about the trade association agreement with Ukraine. So they were pursuing a closer pro-Western policy from that point, much more sharply, which increased even more when Zelensky and Biden came into power, respectively, in their countries. But what I'm interested in is, we all know, of course, the background to the Ukraine conflict is partially that NATO is moving ever closer towards Russia. But why would Russia, you think, decide that this is the only move they could do? Because this military intervention, of course, has no winners. Ukraine doesn't win, Russia doesn't win, the West doesn't win. Even if Russia comes out of this victorious, it will have suffered significant manpower and economical losses. It will not have gained very much from the war, except maybe some fleeting international status. But of course, considering the performance of the Russian army, that their military prestige is reduced. So can you give any insight into why you think the Russians felt that this was the only move they could take?
Well, the Russian perspective is painted in very dark colors. It is informed by history. So Russians have a long memory, right? Even the common people do have much more historical conscience than average Westerner. History, in their view at the moment, is repeating. So what they are seeing happening now with the expansion of NATO is not just some military alliance making some moves. It's a culminative process of empire building to the west, threatening Russia. So they see parallels with the building of the Napoleonic Empire, Hitler's Third Reich expansion. And that's the perspective through which they look at this. And they are seeing that the moment that the last empty space is filled, which are Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, at that moment, confrontation becomes inevitable. That's their perspective on it. And from that moment onwards, there's just a military perspective. They have been preparing for that. That is one of the reasons for the great rearmament program. It is that they were estimating that a certain amount of time was left, and in that time they should prepare. A very similar way Russian history worked before the big campaign of 1812, Napoleon, and the invasion of Russia by Hitler, Operation Barbarossa. So this is they are thinking in these patterns, and no matter what is our perspective on it, this is their national perspective. They feel threatened, and they feel they have no choice. That's the realistic assessment we should give. We should be realistic in recognizing other people's perspective, even if we think it's overdone or over the top.
Yes, because I mean the common argument you hear from centrists, leftists, whatever, is that Ukraine should be able to do what they want, and why does Russia feel threatened? NATO hasn't invaded them, etc. Of course, that is ignoring the reality of geopolitics and the fact that since the 90s, NATO has only gained ground. There was a recent coup, of course, or coup attempt in Kazakhstan in 2008. There was the push in Georgia, for Georgia maybe joining the EU and NATO. So they have a legitimate reason to feel threatened, and the only way they wouldn't be threatened is if they become a second-rate power. And I believe that one of the things that Putin said in his speech was that there is no reason to help the world if there's no place for Russia in it. And that's, I think, a logical perspective that every leader of every nation should take. Why should I care about the world if there is no room for the Netherlands and the Dutch people in it, right?
Yes, so there's another problem here, and that are the borders. So everybody knows that the borders currently officially prevailing in Eastern Europe are drawn in a very artificial way. So Ukraine is a construct made by Lenin and Khrushchev, yes, and the rest of the borders in Eastern Europe also leave a lot to be desired from many national perspectives. That even is true in Western Europe, but of course in Eastern Europe the problem is much more acute. And at the moment that great power politics come into play, as they are doing with the NATO expansion, then these border issues become real sticking points and cannot be ignored. A redrawing of the map is in the cards. That might even apply to the Balkans. Moves in these directions, noises are being made that indicate thoughts going that direction here, also on the Balkans where I'm staying.
Well, that is true. I mean, with the falling away of international stability, particularly economic certainty, of course, with economic uncertainty, political uncertainty follows. And while I do believe that there are quite a few grievances like that, for example, I'm a firm believer that Belgium should not exist, but I'm not sure that there are political parties or politicians who would push for that quite so quickly. I don't think ethnic and territorial conflicts are in the cards anytime soon. It's more likely to result in more demographic problems like another migration issue. And of course, there are already enough problems. We see it with the farmers in the Netherlands, of course, populist issues. The economic problems will probably translate more into populist problems being pushed forward, like with the farmers, like with migration, under people like Geert Wilders, Le Pen, etc. Then I think that it will lead to something like Italy invading Croatia, overtaking back the Istrian coast, that sort of thing. But who knows? It could happen. I would. It would be interesting. The thing is that for Americans listening is, of course, this sort of thing does put things quite on edge a lot more in Europe. For you, it's like a world away. Over here, it's a serious issue. You see those Ukraine flags everywhere, and you're basically accused of being a fifth columnist partisan if you don't support Ukraine over here. And we will be probably, our politicians, our leadership will pursue a policy of supporting Ukraine to our own detriment, to the graves of our own people. We see this with, of course, Germany particularly ruining its own economy. They have got 30% CPI inflation on energy, 10% inflation generally in the economy, energy insecurity. This will start affecting job market soon. Of course, it doesn't help that the Americans, at the same time, the Fed is raising interest rates, forcing the ECB to also raise interest rates, which will put countries like Italy and Greece in jeopardy of paying their sovereign debt, which we've had a sovereign debt crisis, of course, in 2011 with Greece in the Eurozone. If that triggers, you could see another big north-south divide created in the EU. You already saw this with the Movimento Cinque Stelle and Draghi resigning. Was an indirect statement of support for at least buying gas from Russia. The Movimento Cinque Stelle puts the interest of Italians above sanctioning Russia, and they want cheap energy for the common Italian. This is also because they're a populist movement, and populist movements, of course, go for easy vote winners. So yeah, the consequences of this war towards domestic politics throughout Europe are big. Of course, in the Netherlands currently, it's not as big an issue because we've got the whole farmers thing, but that's indirectly affected as well because fertilizer prices, etc., are affected by the war. And with domestic food, if they're going to reduce domestic food production by something like 30% over here, then we will be even more dependent on foreign sources like Ukraine. If, for example, the war ends, Ukraine becomes, whatever left of Ukraine becomes part of the EU, then they will become a food exporter for us.
Yeah, so we are now talking about economic, a little bit social and political fallout in the West, more directly zooming in on the Ukraine. Russia looks, because you asked for the Russian perspective, so in Russia people are looking at strategy, military strategy. That sounds weird, but that's what people are busy with. So the Eurasianist perspective is that geopolitics requires realistic geopolitics requires a knowledge of maps, a knowledge of the land, knowledge of landscapes, a knowledge of what happened on these lands, and a very instinctive feel for so-called energy lines that go through them. And by energy lines, I mean logistic lines, industrial interest positions. And one thing that we can see here playing out and coming into perspective is the eastern Ukraine. So the conflict is focused on eastern Ukraine. That's where Mr. Putin is holding his policing operation. And from the Russian perspective, more specifically from the military perspective, the possession of the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. So the Dnieper River, that's a river that crosses more or less north-south Ukraine, cutting it into two, more or less. The eastern bank of that's an area, flat land, stretching all the way to Moscow, and from there to Volgograd, which was Stalingrad before. And this area is a land of maneuver, a land of open spaces, and a land on which many military campaigns have been, important military campaigns have been decided. I'm giving a few examples for people who do not know. I know you, Faust, know, but so in 1709, Charles XII of Sweden, he was destroyed. His army was destroyed at Poltava, which is located in that area east of Dnieper River in Ukraine. Then after that, the great decisive battles of the Russian Civil War, in which the whites were supported by the West. We should not forget that. They were destroyed also in that area. The decisive battle was the Momontov raid, which took place around Voronezh, also approximately that area on the border with Russia. And then, of course, we all know, people in our movement, that Operation Barbarossa made a very big turn in September 41 when Guderian's tanks switched from direction Moscow to direction Kiev, being shifted south exactly to this area, which is the access area to great industrial regions, the Donbass not only, to strategic positions on the Volga and on the Don, and access to the Caucasus, and from there northward also to Moscow. So the same, of course, repeated in 43, the great decisive battle on the Eastern Front, Kursk, it was also there. So that's something that the Russians are really, really thinking about, and they are occupying themselves with these patterns, with these precedents, and so the Ukrainians, so do the Ukrainian leaders. So as far as Ukraine has an independent policy, which is not too much, but it does have a military that is quite tough. And they have also dug themselves into an area that exactly allows Ukraine to keep a foothold on the eastern side of the Dnieper River. So by digging into the Donbass and by holding the line initially all the way to Mariupol, they in fact keep a maneuverability behind them. They give a maneuver space that can be exploited. They know very well that that is a very important strategic space.
I would say, though, and that is a criticism that we have also heard many times, is that this is Cold War thinking in terms of maneuver warfare and tank battles. The new game, as the American system proves, is diplomatic and subversion through media and through control of the message to the population. I mean, NATO expanded all the way to Belarusia without ever fighting a single war. Well, there was the conflict in Serbia, but they could have stayed out of that if they wanted to. The whole game of geopolitics is controlled through, for example, in a situation of Brazil, controlled through economics, controlled through media. You see this with, for example, in Argentina and Chile, where leftist presidents have been elected and immediately start implementing issues which are current in American media, like Black Lives Matter, like transgenderism, homosexual marriage, etc. This is 21st century politics and geopolitics as it is conducted today. The resort to arms, I mean, that's always been, of course, Clausewitz said, war is diplomacy by other means, but it is a resort one goes to in extremes. So I think it's their strategy from Russia's perspective is poorly thought out, and that's why I kind of want to ask about why would you think that the only resort is to go to war, where a counter coup, for example, in Ukraine, pushing and supporting the native elements there, supporting populist elements throughout Europe, etc., would have maybe been a much better soft power strategy that the Russians could have pursued. And the mentality in the Kremlin doesn't seem to be updated on these sorts of tactics. Before I give the word back to you, I want to say two things addressed in the chat. Someone was talking about international law. One thing this war proves very much is that international law is a joke, and that as I think it was Thucydides said, the strong do as they will, the weak suffer what they must. Every side in this conflict is committing war crimes, and absolutely no one in Western media cares, except when the Russians do it. But of course, the Ukrainians commit war crimes as well. The Russians have sort of an undeclared war ongoing. The West is sending weapons, but there's no open declaration of war. It's simple proof of might makes right, essentially. So international law is a joke. International law is just a cover story for American imperialists to justify their actions, and they're more and more nakedly over the recent decades not even using it. They just do what they want, like that general who said that if an American soldier was ever put for trial at The Hague, they would send an aircraft carrier to come fetch him. So international law is a joke. Then someone here in the chat was repeatedly saying that Ukrainians are not a threat of leftism. They're not a threat to liberalism. No, they're a tool being used by liberalism to attack an opponent. I think Ukraine in this is nothing more than a speelbal, as we would say in Dutch. Their bigger powers are using them for their own goals on both sides. All right, that's what I had to say for this one.
Yes, well, you're talking about the other aspects of war, so non-military war. I do believe that Russia is very well aware of the fact that they are in a multi-dimensional warfare state, that one-dimensional military war is no longer an option. I just believe that they are having a very different strategy. They basically have given up trying to counter any kind of media messages that are being put out in the West. They have given up on that. That's just a policy decision. It's not that they are not aware of it. Also, they do not believe that going beyond the Russian Orthodox sphere, so outside the Balkans, because they are Orthodox countries there as well, allows them any kind of an initiative outside of that sphere would be handicapped in their view, because they feel handicapped in terms of civilizational values. This is a very important thing to remember. They believe in a certain way, in the same that somebody like Huntington believed, right? That there is a clash of civilizations and there are very strong borders, strong boundaries between them that are basically impermeable. You cannot overcome them except through the kinetic force. So Russia is waging a defensive battle. That's how they see it. They say the West has crossed the line into the Russian sphere, the Russian civilizational sphere. They feel the same about the Eastern Balkans, and this is their sticking point. Their sticking point is not that they do not that they feel threatened as a world power. They feel threatened in their own identity. They feel threatened on their own soil, and they feel threatened in their own most direct, vital interests. It's like somebody's coming too close to you and you don't want him there. You push him out. You say, listen, this is not going to happen. Move.
There was, of course, the famous article that Putin wrote and published where he argued that Ukrainians and Russians are one people divided only by some historical issues, and that the Russian people are originally, of course, from what is now Ukraine, which is true. Kiev on the Rus is where the Russian nation sort of started. There are a number of places, Muscovy and Novgorod, of course, are also seats of where the Russian identity started, but Kiev was an important one as well. And yeah, Putin did make that argument that it is vital to Russian identity that it would be in their sphere. Yeah. You see,
yes, I could.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are talking here about Ukrainian nationalism. So what's that? The real Ukrainian nationalism, the authentic Ukrainian nationalism that existed historically, it's located in what we call now Western Ukraine. It used to be Galicia and Ruthenia. It's an area which was under Polish rule for a very long time. Because of this, came under so-called unionist identity. Unionist. It means an Orthodox population that has an allegiance to the Roman Church, that is united with the Roman Church. That was a kind of a compromise situation. And also this area, they're speaking a dialect that's quite far from Russian. It's a little bit further removed than Flemish from Dutch. And this gives them some kind of a basis to say that there is a Ukrainian nation there. That you could argue that. That would be legitimate. Even Russians do not deny that there is such a thing as a Ukrainian identity in that area. I mean, I'm talking about the western 1/3 approximately of Ukraine. So everything, let's say, west of Vinica, where Hitler had his Wehrwolf bunker. So from that point onwards, westward, you can argue there really exists something like a Ukrainian nation. And the status of that nation...
One can also argue that large parts of what is today White Russia and Ukraine historically were parts of Poland, because the Polish borders after the Second World War, of course, moved considerably westwards.
The great dividing line that is vital for Russia is the religious line. So they believe that the Orthodox people, Russian-speaking or Russian dialect-speaking Orthodox people, they should be allowed to live inside Russia. The same applies, by the way, for certain cities in the Baltics, like Narva and Daugavpils, right? The old Dunaburg. They are majority Russian inhabited areas. And they also, in fact, they would want them back. In the long term, they will try to get them back. And this is an important point to make. So religion here is not an unimportant factor. It's an identity-forming element that informs Russian policy, no matter whether we find it relevant or not, no matter if it crosses boundaries that we don't like to be crossed. That's just a fact of perception on the Russian side.
Well, I personally look forward to the sixth separation of Poland, but that's not going to happen anytime soon, I don't think. Because, dan zich Pommeren Stettin in deutsche Städte wie Berlin. But of course, those historical arguments can be made, but we have to also look at the political reality today. Someone in the chat made the argument from, well, why is Russia concerned about being invaded? And I think that is sort of a legitimate point to make, because I don't think they would take Russia out with a direct military invasion. For example, I wonder if the Kremlin has considered at all what will happen if Putin dies. Who will take power and will...
I think from a Eurasianist perspective, certainly from a Russian perspective, this point needs correction. Russia has been already invaded, according to Russians. They think that everything that happened after 2004, even the plain fact that Ukraine is a so-called independent state and is allowed to negotiate at all with any Western institutions, is an act of aggression. It's doing damage to the Russian motherland. That's the perception there. No matter what we think about it.
Right. Well, that might be their perception, but again, that invasion was not militarily done. It was done with soft power, like I said before. And the genuine bigger concern than Ukraine aligning with NATO would be what happens in a succession crisis after Putin dies. It's very likely that the culture will be subverted by whoever follows up Putin because of the power of Western media, which they've done nothing to counter. You say that they've, as a policy, decided to stop countering Western media, but I think that that's the dumbest idea you could have, because that should be at your absolute top priority to prevent your own population from becoming indoctrinated. Because if you don't have your own people in line with what the thinking is, like if they forget their own identities, like many people in the West have done, and they start even speaking half mixed English rather than their native language, then there is no hope for a future.
Well, look, the Russians have given up on the West, on influencing the Western populations by soft power means. But they haven't given up on influencing people within the so-called Russia sphere, within the Orthodox sphere, or for that matter, in any other area of the world. It's just in the Western heartland that they have given up on it, for specific reasons. Inside Russia, we should not forget the sanctions are having a very positive effect, because Russian people are now cut off from Western propaganda sources. They don't have access to things like porn channels, propaganda channels, McDonald's. Life expectancy of Russians, as somebody said, will probably rise considerably, even despite the Ukraine war. So it's a matter of how you look at it. I think a matter of spiritual health as well. So,
go ahead.
Look, for us in the West, we are supposed to be decadent people, like sitting back on the chair and only thinking about money and sex, right? Basically, I mean, it's a kind of a shortcut to most people's central life perspective. But that's a whole different ballgame in Russia. So suffering, sacrifice, a military career, dying for the motherland, there are values there. There are actual appreciated values. There are even some people writing for the same outfit I'm writing for, Geopolitica, who welcomed the war, who said, this is great, because now for the first time we can discipline, we can learn the value of life. And even if we have to fight with our brothers who are in Ukraine, we can all learn from this process and cure ourselves of many illusions. It might be a take that we find very far from our reality, but it's an important take because it says something about what is what is on the east of that so-called, I call it tin curtain, that's now falling down.
Well, that's very much will to power thinking. Like a good war will fix us all up and remove the degeneracy from society. We'll have to see. Wars do usually, especially losing wars, cause shake-ups in society. Just look at the Vietnam War and the changing culture in the United States, for example. So it will undoubtedly have an effect on Russian culture, but the question is if it will go in the direction that they hope.
Let's not forget another thing here. They think they're going to win. So
Right.
you're talking about losing, but that's not the Russian experience.
But see, even if the Russians achieve their tactical strategic objectives in Ukraine, so for example, they take the entirety of the east of the Dnieper, that's not a victory except on the ground. It still isolates Russia internationally, costs them a lot of money. I mean, you're right that, of course, they have since 2014 taken a lot of steps towards economic autarky, but they're still very much dependent on. I mean, in this sense, things have not changed since the time of the 1920s. That they are dependent on, especially German heavy machinery and technology, and of course, how the German Wehrmacht was built up was through exchange of technological tractors, machines, engines for Russian raw resources like steel, grain, and oil. And that's sort of the economical paradigm that still exists. That's still the economic relation between Germany and Russia.
Well, I should qualify my statement a bit about the defensive experience of Russia. So Russia is fighting from its own perspective a defensive war, actually not a war, it's conducting a defensive policing operation with the Russian gloves. These are Russian gloves on, right? And this defensive posture needs some qualification because the goals, the strategic goals in Russia at the moment, as far as I understand them, are quite quite larger. They are larger than just a defensive victory. I do believe that they realize that this conflict is widening into a global showdown between the West and what they call the new Eurasian pole. And they believe they will win it. They believe that exerting pressure on the battlefield as well as exerting new political initiatives outside of the Eurasian continent in total will bring down or will severely handicap the West. And the jury is out on it if that will succeed. But I do believe we should think about this in terms also of ambition. The ambition to actually destroy NATO and the EU exists in Russia.
Well, NATO and the EU will not be destroyed by Russia on the battlefield. It will destroy itself, most likely. That's the whole thing, that's why I'm trying to emphasize propaganda, soft power, and media as being so important. The United States military this year has failed to meet any of its recruitment goals. So because the population is propagandized against its own nation, because the population is degenerate, fat, and is not, the mentality isn't there, there's no idea of serving the nation or anything, the military will be weakened regardless, and they will increasingly be reliant on using technology to shore up their manpower weaknesses. And the same thing with how these alliances will fall apart is under if the reason Europe follows America so closely in the American policy goals, even to our own active detriment, is because the population and the politicians have been propagandized to think that this is the only way forward. So really, the question of media as a weapon is very important here. And the way that, for example, a China or an India would lose against the United States would not be in a battlefield situation, but would be if, for example, the Chinese population starts adopting Western values. This is less an issue in China, of course, because they are very actively trying to prevent this with their firewall and such. But it is in India, for example, a bigger problem, despite there being a strong Hindu nationalist sentiment and Modi being a quite hard right-wing leader. The young generations in India who consume Western media and who speak English are being affected with the same values. So the real big emphasis on anyone trying to oppose the West should be in keeping their own population informed of what they actually stand for and their own values. And you don't need to confront the West militarily. You just need to hold out till 2040 or so, and the West will collapse anyway, if you ask me. Especially with the Western leadership, which is all airheaded and concerned with non-issues like transgender passports, are being pressed with their faces into the reality of economic, basically economic disruption to a degree that the population will rise up. So there isn't the way Russia can win is more through media and economic warfare than through military action in Ukraine, I think. And I don't think there is a winning outcome in Ukraine for Russia or for Ukraine. Even if Ukraine managed to hold on to any form of independence, they will become a NATO puppet, and the rest will go to Russia. So,
well, we are talking about attrition warfare here, right? Attrition warfare, that's what's happening in the Donbass, but it's also happening militarily, but it's also happening on the world economic scale, right? Attrition warfare. So basically, going all out in confrontation with the West allows Russia to slowly sap Western strength, drive up inflation, eat up resources. I mean, most redundant army stocks of Europe are already used up, depleting reserves, especially in Europe, and forcing higher energy prices. They are just part of this. Mm-hmm. And this whole softening up process has a military component in it. It must have that. And I think Russia, to a large extent, actually is quite satisfied with the present situation, because the West has been forced to extend its levers very far into the deep spaces of Russia, like Napoleon, like Hitler, long lines of logistics that are vulnerable, big exertion that has to be made.
Right, but let's say that's true. Or let's say Western military might is depleted, our stores are materially, this has no real consequence because we are not fighting an active war. Russia is not going to invade Finland or Sweden or Norway or anything like that. They're not going to invade Poland as a follow-up. So the fact we could send all our military equipment to Ukraine and there would change very little in the geopolitical scale of things because we are not under threat of any kind of active war.
Ratcheting up the pressure, I think it creates a situation in which, first of all, there can be protests in the West, there can be a breakup, there can be stresses put on the alliances, which you're already seeing in the Balkans. This information is being very much suppressed in Western media, but there has been almost a quasi-coup. Most people don't know that in Bulgaria, where the defense minister has been forced to resign. There have been rumblings in the Romanian army. Hungary has more publicly disavowed the Western alliance in many ways. And Serbia has already made noises about settling old scores in Kosovo and in Bosnia as a follow-up to this crisis. They are arming to the teeth, right? Arms sales in this region have gone up exponentially.
Most likely, ironically, some of it being weapons delivered to Ukraine and sold to them.
They are sold at a very, very advantageous price to certain people in the Balkans. So yes, and I believe this ratcheting up of this pressure that's happening through the confrontation in eastern Ukraine is a winning strategy. I do believe that if this situation continues long enough, Russia can actually win. And noises have been made out of the Kremlin. For example, statements have been made like this: the longer the crisis goes on, the more we will require, the more difficult it will be to negotiate with us. I think that's exactly true. They believe that the longer this war goes on, the more they stand to gain and the more perspectives they have. And I do believe they have a point. I do not think the West is immune to the pressures that are being put upon it on all kinds of levels. Maybe not in the soft power way that you are talking about, but in the pocket, to the economic aspect, and in energy ways, end in losing standing in the rest of the world and being cut off by many other parts of the world. That could very well happen. In the
Essentially,
south,
the argument,
there is a big struggle going on between the Eurasia and the West.
yes, as you so sort of part of your argument is that the depletion of Western weapon stores would make civil unrest in the West easier. Would, for example, allow like we're not at the point that we need to use javelins on farming tractors, but your argument is if they don't have the javelins anyway, then that's at least not a concern.
Well, let's put it like this. If a government has a weak army, it is always more vulnerable to outside pressures. And at that moment, internal stability becomes very important. So the slightest breach of a good deterrent, a good arms deterrent, makes you vulnerable in the long term. We do not know what will happen, for example,
well, I think that
in America.
It's actually the reverse, I think, because short-term weapons stocks are depleted. Long-term, a lot of European nations are more heavily investing in defense. Poland will triple its military in the coming 10 years. Germany will double its budget in the coming few years. Norway has increased budgets. Sweden has increased budgets. So short-term, there might be room for civil instability, but long-term, there will be more materiel and troops to deter any such thing. At least as long as things look now. So that's actually a negative.
Also not forget another thing. The experience of waging war, which is Russia is going through now, is building up the nation's strength. So they're becoming autarkic. They're streamlining their economy. The people are getting used to be on a war footing. And their army is being trained in all kinds of ways that Western armies are not being trained. This gives them an advantage, at least in the conventional sphere. Also, this can be important when other proxy wars break out. For example, in Africa, we already had one in Central African Republic, where Russian mercenaries confront Western mercenaries. And there are other places where the same can happen very easily. So in the long run, this particular experience is not necessarily in the West advantage. That's how I look at it.
I think we're sort of going in circles here, but I maintain that the greater threat to the West is not militarily, but it is internal disunity over moral and political issues and economic pressure, which is a weapon that Russia can use indeed. There was a few things, one from the chat. Someone said that the West is liberal and we all stand for liberalism and it's a good thing. The Ukrainians are fighting for liberalism and so on. I mean, this man has never had a critical thought in his life, I don't think. I mean, that's the narrative from the media one-to-one. Liberalism is an Anglo idea. We had hardline monarchies in charge of most of the continent up until the First World War. What are you talking about? Furthermore, most of Western philosophy is not liberal. Nietzsche is not liberal. Kant is not liberal. Plato is not liberal, etc. So no, and Christianity is not a liberal worldview. It has misericordia and mercy and so built in it, but it is not liberal. There's an absolute head of the church.
I do believe there are some words to be said about this liberal religion, right? This Anglo religion called liberalism. So, Little Russia, otherwise known as Ukraine, has had experience of this liberal life now for, let's say, a decade, more or less. And this is something that Russians have set up and taken notice of. They have seen what happened there. The Ukrainians are their neighbors. They live close with them. They visit each other till recently. And they have seen what happened in Ukraine. And this has not been an example that recommends itself to anybody, seeing it being imposed in the way it was imposed in Ukraine, right? So we had there a regime for about a decade that was one of the most corrupt countries in the world, right? The arms trade, the people smuggling, pedo networks,
yes,
all kinds of
a very corrupt country.
let's say the organ trade, all kinds of horrible things happened over there. Not saying about the experience of the shelling of Donetsk and Lugansk. I'm talking about just how liberalism has impacted the Ukraine, how it has destroyed the economy, social cohesion, how it has poisoned the whole social life over there. The introduction of the gay agenda has not been something that has been welcomed there. And I think overall there is a large shift in perception happening in Ukraine as well as in Russia. People are now seeing liberalism for what it is by being subjected to its worst outcomes. And I do believe the attraction of that model has fallen completely away. People are falling back on their own roots rather than being seduced into those liberal modes. I think the liberalism is dead for Russians. I even think for Ukrainians.
Yeah, well, I will agree. Ukraine is a very corrupt nation, and again, I started slightly on this in the beginning, but I do have some criticism of Ukrainian nationalists and how they conducted themselves over the last 8-10 or so years, because the Western media has, of course, always been denying that Azov was political in any kind of way, but Azov was, of course, a neo-fascist movement and had quite a lot of popular support and connections in Western Europe. I know at least 2 people who went to volunteer in Ukraine and served with Azov from Dutch and national movements. So they were seen in the period 2014 until this war as sort of vanguard example of how things could be done with genuine political influence and having influence in the military and so on, how nationalists maybe could take an example from them. But unfortunately, I think they were far too focused on old styles and old symbolism. I mean, in a 99% white country, then white identity is not a priority that needs to be established. Their very strong opposition to Russia is understandable, because I understand that as a nationalist, you want to maintain the sovereignty of your own nation, and you don't particularly feel like being ruled over by Russia. But of course, the reality is if you're not ruled over by Russia, or at least in the Russian sphere, you will be ruled over by the Americans. And really, that's an easy choice to make, at least in my opinion. Either way, trying to follow as neutral as possible a path would have been the preferable option. Of course, the Ukrainians themselves made it very difficult by electing someone like Zelensky, who immediately went for very hard warlike rhetoric. But on the whole, I think that nationalists can take an example from how things with the Banderites and Azov and so on conducted themselves in Ukraine, with very narrow-minded, very short view, short time perspective way they dealt with things, with very bad optics. And not really a complete philosophy. They had no real economic message, no real geopolitical strategy. They barely seemed to realize what sort of role they were playing in their geopolitical position. So I do think that there's plenty to be criticized about Ukrainian nationalists as well. If they hadn't been so willing to play ball with the Americans, they probably would not have been invaded. So there's that criticism to make, I think.
Well, yes, I made some remarks about historical, authentic nationalism existing in Western Ukraine. But that should be qualified, of course. The present nationalism that we are seeing in Ukraine, in my view, is an artificial import, an artificial construct that's being paid for, and that's being constructed largely by Western intelligence operations. So we do know that the CIA and its predecessors never had a problem employing nationalists and Nazis anywhere. They did so in South America, they did so in Europe, and they do so in Ukraine. And it is just a tactic of using the enemy of your enemy in an efficient way. So I do not believe that what we are seeing currently as the Ukrainian nationalism is in any way, shape, or form authentic. I think it's a construct, a globalist construct, that's being utilized as part of a larger globalist network. I even suspect that there are people that are well known in the West, nationalist leaders, who have been infiltrated by, let's say, the Western intelligence services as far as their Ukrainian contacts go. And that's very simple because these Ukrainian contacts, these Ukrainian nationalists, they are the edge of the sword of Ukraine, right? Militarily speaking, they are at the cutting edge. Ukrainian morale, we must understand, of the mass army that is there is very low. It is not employable in any way, shape, or form as a normal army to oppose the Russian army. That couldn't take place. They need a fanatic edge and a kind of a firewall between themselves and the Russians to survive. And that's what they have been doing. Another criticism of the Ukrainian nationalism that really should be made is their cruelty. And that's something that's also present in the historical Ukrainian nationalism. So if we look at Bandera, right, the UPA, it was the independence movement fighting against Stalin in the closing years of the Second World War and thereafter, which was, this movement was supported by the Wehrmacht in the last stage of the Second World War and later by Western intelligence services. They were known, they were famous, infamous for their cruelty, for their barbarism, their cutting up.
Hilfswillige Bataillone, which were used for cleaning up operations of undesirables, yes, were from a very large part were recruited from Ruthenian and Galician Ukrainians, indeed, heavy battalions they call them. Yeah.
This area.
They would do the photos you see sometimes of pits dug out with people in them, and then people with rifles shooting them. Those are heavies usually.
We should not forget this area of Europe is called the Bloodlands for a reason, right? Cruelty all the way dating back to the Khmelnytsky riots, mid-17th century, which were anti-Polish and anti-Jewish, through the later pogroms, through the Russian Civil War, which saw atrocity on both sides. They show abhorrent violence, which we are seeing recurring now in the Ukraine. In fact, we can say that the Wehrmacht conducted itself comparatively exemplary in that area. If you're looking at what the Cheka did and what the UPA did, the UPA and its adversary, the NKVD, what they did there, it cannot be described by any words. Mm-hmm. And I think we are seeing repeats of that demoralizing use of terror, purposeful terror on civilian populations there.
Well, that's very true, especially in the opening weeks of the war. A lot of footage was leaked of absolutely indiscriminate behavior, but from both sides, Russians, Ukrainians. They were shelling civilians, they were executing prisoners, torturing prisoners. Yes, I mean, this war, that's what I said earlier. This war has proven that international law and human rights are a joke, because everybody's committing war crimes and nobody's talking about it.
Well, I do believe that here Russia has a point. Russia has seen that the West has abandoned all pretenses to international law. It has been confiscating bank accounts, it has been confiscating gold reserves, which has never happened, not even in the Second World War. It's just thrown out all the rules. And it has also thrown out all the rules in the Ukraine in warfare terms. Right? I mean, biotech laboratories have been discovered working on viruses just on the Russian border. Massacres have been perpetrated against civilian populations that are not being published in the West. And I think Russia is right. They see themselves confronted with this kind of I call it a mad dog West, right? In a late Rabiate state West. What should they do? I believe they're correctly acting in their own self-interest, in a sense of preservation of national sovereignty and their direct livelihood. And I do not think any pity can be expected from Russia to the West once they win that war, seeing what they have been subjected through the last 30 years from the West.
Well, that is true. I mean, the West, and in this case particularly, of course, America, but also following their footsteps, the EU, has been very unreliable as a diplomatic partner. I mean, the amount of proxy conflicts and wars that we've had over the last 20 years in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, and so on, which have had absolutely no benefit to us, are an example of this. But Yeah, I understand the perspective that the Russians and probably the Chinese have, that politicians roulette every 4 to 8 years. You get completely different policies from them. And then on the whole, the trend in the West has been increasingly towards, as you say, more and more naked disregard of their own rules. For example, the whole idea of the past Bretton Woods economic system, that the dollar would be the international reserve currency, would also be expected with financial responsibility from the Americans to manage that dollar properly. And instead, they printed $7 trillion, something like 30% of dollars in existence over the corona crisis, which is part of the inflation that we're seeing now, although this inflation is for a large part not monetary. And yes, the seizure of assets in the Banks of London of private Russian citizens is another break of the idea of property rights. We saw a lot of Saudis and so on moving their money out of the city of London after that, because they were concerned that in any future geopolitical conflict where they might be involved against the Americans, they would lose their assets. So in Dutch we would say kat in het nauw maakt rare sprongen. And I do think American elites feel, and Western elites feel pressured because they realize that they're increasingly less popular and their power is slowly grasping out of control. And this will result in increasingly more repressive measures domestically as well, and increasingly stupid moves internationally, such as letting this escalate into an open war, such as destroying the economy because it's not just the supply side chain disruption in Russia, of course. I mean, steel, aluminium, wheat, and oil and gas are all more expensive because of Russia, but there's also the issue of the Federal Reserve increasing rents and pulling dollars out of international markets, destabilizing other countries who need dollars for international trade. So
yes, I think there is one thing that is a parallel to the Cold War, in that the global South here is becoming a battlefield. It's now an economic battlefield where both sides, the Eurasian pole, let's say, and the West now find an open field where they have to compete in terms of economy, in terms of finance. And it's the outcome of that long-term competition is completely unknown. Both set out from zero, in fact, and we will see what will develop from that. What I do hope is that the West can be split, and that the continental Europe stops allying itself and listening to America, the Anglos, and that would make a real difference. It would not only make our life better materially, it would also allow for this conflict not to escalate. This conflict would be controllable once Germany and France pull the plug on it. I'm not saying they will do that, not in the present constellations, but maybe seeing enough pressure resulting in regime change in the long term could achieve that.
Yes, but regime change in any Western country at the moment is quite unlikely. Maybe some shifts through electoral politics, particularly Italy at the moment is a wild card with possible new elections and seeing the popularity of Fratelli d'Italia and other right-wing conservative parties. But I mean, I don't see a regime change on the horizon anytime soon. But in 5 years, with continuing economic issues, who knows, right? People change their if they actually come into economic difficulty, people will start having to face reality, and people will act on that. So then maybe things will change, but for now I don't expect there will be huge changes. We will continue this war as it is for as long as it's necessary, as long as Ukrainians and Russians.
I do want to say one more thing about the military aspect of it. I do believe that in the West, because we are nations conditioned to a long peace inside Europe, living very decadent lifestyles, living very comfortable in comfort zones and in bubbles, we as a whole, as nations, have lost partially touch with reality. A kinetic reality which is very present in Russia, in Eastern Europe in general. And I do believe that the risk of war is something that is not grasped properly, neither by Western population, nor by the Western media, nor by Western politicians. They are seeing this in terms of a game, a soft power game that I have been playing for many decades now. And I do believe there really does exist a real risk of escalation into a global war, a world war. This risk exists. Anybody that has any contact in Russia, has been there, has spoken to people there, knows that's true. This risk exists. And it is not something that we, in the new right, the dissident right, have a power to influence, because our audience is very small. But at least for ourselves, we should have this realistic assessment that it is not just a scaremongering of some old journalists who are reliving the Cuba crisis. No. There is a real risk here. Russia should not be underestimated. It should not be underestimated in any sense, including in the speed by which they can act. We should here point out one thing that is also of military strategy is important. So people think that Russia has modernized its rocket systems and its nuclear arsenal, which is true to a certain extent. But we should never forget that both the Russians and the Chinese have done so from a position of weakness. Because America has been in a situation that it has almost had first strike capability. This means the ability to hit the enemy without being significantly degraded itself in response. It has been on the edge of achieving that status. And so all the weaponry that Russia and China have been developing in that field has been designed to avert that risk, that first strike capability. But there is a price tag attached to that. That means that the kind of weapon systems that they possess are, most of them, use them or lose them. And that's something that's important just for us to know, to remember.
Right. Well, Russia has proven that it has a capable defense industry in terms of innovation, but not in terms of mass production. They're still reliant on quite a lot of old material to fight this current war. But I think, we can sort of conclude on that one that we shouldn't underestimate Russia. Europe needs to set its own course away from the Americans. And this war is not over anytime soon. And it will cause further destabilization in the West. And again, used in the beginning of this set that the alt-right, dissident right, whatever you want to call it, has lost momentum. Nationalist movements in Europe definitely need to work on being in a position to be able to use the coming chaos, because otherwise other forces will do so. And that will not result in anything positive
Amen.
for our populations. All right. Well, if you have do you have anything to conclude with?
No, I can only support the last statement. It's very true. It would be a good opportunity for Western nationalists to prepare for what they would actually do. What would they actually do if they can get power? It is something that has been very far from our minds. But the scenario in which it is possible is probably closer now than it was ever in the last decades. For the good and for the bad.
Yes.
Thank you.
So get organized. Right. Thank you very much to Wolfheze for coming on. To the audience, I'll do another stream soon. Start making content some more. Thank you all for listening and have a good night.